In the spring of 1853, four massive, soot-belching warships flew into the tranquil waters of Edo Bay, tearing through the pristine isolation that had shielded Japan from the outside world for over 250 years. To the terrified fishermen on the coast, these black ships, commanded by American Commodore Matthew Perry, looked less like vessels and more like floating volcanoes, their massive cannons aimed directly at the heart of the shogunate. Japan was suddenly pushed into a brutal, existential choice: allow itself to be colonized and carved up by Western powers like its neighbor China, or fundamentally dismantle its ancient feudal identity to become a modern empire overnight. What followed was a whirlwind of political assassinations, bloody civil war, and a radical cultural transformation that would completely reshape the global balance of power. This is the story of the Meiji Restoration, the ultimate historical crucible where the age of the samurai died, and the dawn of a modern superpower was born. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, we must first look into the frozen world of Tokugawa Japan. For over 2.5 centuries, the country had been ruled not by the emperor, who lived as a secluded, powerless, spiritual figurehead in the ancient palaces of Kyoto, but by the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo, modern-day Tokyo. The shogun was the absolute military dictator of the land, enforcing a strict policy known as sakoku, or the locked country. Under penalty of death, no foreigner was permitted to enter Japan, and no Japanese citizen was allowed to leave. The borders were sealed, and the ocean was treated as an uncrossable wall. This deep isolation created a highly structured, peaceful but brittle feudal society. At the top of the social pyramid stood the samurai, an elite warrior class who wore the traditional two swords and lived by a rigid code of loyalty and honor. Beneath them were the farmers who tilled the rice fields, the artisans who forged the steel, and at the absolute bottom, the merchants who, despite growing increasingly wealthy, were looked down upon by the ruling military elite. For generations, this world seemed eternal, a beautifully preserved ecosystem of tea houses, woodblock prints, and silent castle walls. But beneath the surface, the foundations were rotting. The shogunate was deeply in debt. Samurai were reduced to underpaid bureaucrats with no wars left to fight, and peasant rebellions were flaring across the provinces due to frequent famines. The arrival of Matthew Perry's black ships did not create the crisis. It merely shattered the fragile glass that kept the internal pressures from exploding. The shogun, realizing his outdated shore batteries and matchlock muskets were completely useless against the industrial might of the American Navy, succumbed to Perry's demands. He signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening up treaty ports and granting humiliating legal and trade privileges to Western powers. Soon, a torrent of foreign diplomats and merchants flooded into port cities like Yokohama, bringing with them a destabilizing influx of foreign currency that caused catastrophic inflation across the islands. Rice prices skyrocketed, famines intensified, and the domestic economy collapsed into chaos. This capitulation sent a shockwave of fury through the samurai class, instantly splitting the ruling elite into two warring ideological factions. On one side stood the Kaikoku pragmatists, who believed opening the borders was an unfortunate necessity for survival. On the other side stood the furious traditionalists, to whom the shogunate had failed its most sacred duty: to protect the sacred soil of Japan from the barbarians. A radical political movement began to coalesce in the distant, rebellious southern domains of Choshu and Satsuma. These domains had a long history of resentment against the Tokugawa clan, stretching back to their defeat at the Battle of Sekigahara 2 centuries prior, and they found a powerful unifying slogan that would become the battle cry of a revolution: Sono Joy, revere the emperor, Expel the Barbarian. Young, low-ranking samurai abandoned their posts, becoming ronin, masterless warriors, and forming underground networks of political assassins known as the shishi, or men of high purpose. Armed with razor-sharp katanas, these idealistic fanatics stalked the foggy streets of Kyoto and Edo, assassinating shogunate officials and attacking foreign merchants, determined to plunge the country into chaos to force a rebirth. Kyoto quickly transformed into a slaughterhouse. Shogunate secret police units, most notably the legendary Shinzangumi, a paramilitary force of elite swordsmen fiercely loyal to the shogun, waged a shadow war against the shishi. In the sweltering summer of 1864, this blood feud exploded during the Ikedaya incident when the Shinzangumi raided a Kyoto inn, ambusing a secret gathering of Choshu radicals and engaging in a ferocious room-to-room sword fight that left the floors drenched in blood. Rather than crushing the rebellion, this brutality only hardened the radicals' resolve. Among these early ideological leaders was a brilliant young teacher named Yoshida Shoin from the Choshu domain. Operating from a tiny village school, Shoin taught his students that the old feudal order was obsolete. He argued that to save Japan from Western dominance, the country must look past tribal domain loyalties, unify under the direct rule of the emperor, and adopt the very technology of the Westerners to eventually defeat them. Though Shoin was eventually arrested and executed by the shogunate, his ideas took root in the minds of his pupils. Young men like Ito Hirobumi and Yamagata Aritomo, who would soon become the master architects of the new Japan. As the 1860s unfolded, the southern domains of Choshu and Satsuma realized that the joy part of their slogan expelling the barbarians through raw force was a romantic illusion. When Choshu forces fired on Western ships in the Straits of Shimonoseki, Allied Western fleets responded by bombarding the coast, obliterating the domain's shore defenses in a matter of hours. Simultaneously, British warships bombarded Satsuma's capital of Kagoshima in retaliation for the murder of a British merchant. These humiliating defeats taught the southern samurai a profound pragmatic lesson. You cannot expel the barbarian with a sword, you must learn his secrets. Yet despite their shared realization, Choshu and Satsuma remained bitter, historic rivals, refusing to cooperate. It took the intervention of a visionary, charismatic ronin named Sakamoto Ryoma to change the course of history. Ryoma, a man who uniquely wore traditional samurai robes paired with Western leather boots, recognized that as long as the southern domains remained divided, the shogunate would destroy them piecemeal. Navigating the treacherous criminal underworld and avoiding constant assassination attempts, Ryoma acted as a ghost diplomat. In a stunning political pivot orchestrated by Ryoma, the brilliant Satsuma statesman Saigo Takamori and his Choshu counterpart Kido Takayoshi forged a secret alliance. They stopped fighting each other and stopped attacking foreigners. Instead, they began secretly buying modern Western rifles and steamships through international merchants like the Scotsman Thomas Glover in Nagasaki. They completely reorganized their military forces, creating revolutionary new infantry units that mixed samurai with ordinary peasants, training them to move in Western-style military formations and fire modern minié-ball rifles. The age of individual samurai champions challenging enemies to single combat on the battlefield was coming to an end. The era of industrialized, disciplined warfare had arrived. The breaking point came in late 1867. The old Tokugawa shogun died, and his successor, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, realized that his political authority was evaporating. In a desperate bid to preserve his family's influence, Yoshinobu formally resigned as shogun, offering to return political power to the newly enthroned 15-year-old Emperor Mutsuhito. Yoshinobu hoped that by voluntarily surrendering the title, he would be appointed as the prime minister of a new ruling council, keeping his vast family lands and true power intact. But the Southern Alliance had no intention of letting the Tokugawa retain their grip on the nation. On January 3, 1868, Saigo Takamori and his loyal troops staged a daring coup d'état in Kyoto. They seized the imperial palace, declared the total restoration of direct imperial rule, and stripped the Tokugawa clan of all their lands and offices. The young Emperor Mutsuhito took the reign name Meiji, meaning enlightened rule. The Tokugawa loyalists were furious, and the country erupted into a bloody civil war, known as the Boshin War. The first major confrontation occurred at the Battle of Toba-Fushimi, just outside Kyoto. A massive shogunate army of 15,000 marched toward the city, confident that their superior numbers would crush the southern rebels. But Saigo Takamori's forces, numbering only 5,000, possessed a devastating technological advantage. Modern Armstrong artillery, Gatling guns, and repeating rifles. As the shogunate cavalry and swordsmen charged across the open fields, they were mowed down by walls of lead. When the rebel forces hoisted the imperial silk banner, showing they had the official blessing of the emperor, the shogunate troops lost their will to fight, fracturing into a chaotic retreat. The imperial forces marched relentlessly toward Edo, realizing that further resistance would lead to the total destruction of the capital. Tokugawa Yoshinobu surrendered Edo Castle without a fight, stepping into peaceful retirement. The city of Edo was renamed Tokyo, the Eastern capital, and the young Emperor Meiji moved his court out of the ancient temples of Kyoto into the massive stone walls of the former shogun's palace. However, the war was far from over. A fleet of shogunate diehards, led by Admiral Enomoto Takeaki and accompanied by a handful of French military advisors who refused to abandon their allies, fled north to the rugged island of Hokkaido. There, they captured the star fortress of Goryokaku and established the short-lived Republic of Ezo, Japan's first and only attempt at a breakaway republic. It wasn't until the summer of 1869, after a brutal combined land and sea assault featuring imperial ironclad warships, that the northern resistance finally surrendered, bringing a definitive end to the civil war. With the military victory secure, the young samurai leaders who ran the government in the name of the emperor unleashed a revolution from above that completely dismantled the fabric of traditional Japan. They realized that to revise the humiliating unequal treaties signed with the West, Japan had to prove it was a fully modernized, civilized nation. In 1871, the government launched the Iwakura mission, a massive diplomatic and fact-finding expedition that sent half of the top government cabinet, along with dozens of young students, on a 2-year journey across America and Europe. These elite travelers walked through the textile mills of Manchester, the factories of Krupp in Germany, and the halls of the US Congress. They took meticulous notes on everything from sewage systems and banking laws to military organization and public school curriculums. They returned to Tokyo with a new, urgent slogan that would guide the next decade: Fukoku Kyohei. Enrich the country, strengthen the military. But while the Iwakura mission was away, a fierce ideological schism tore through the temporary government left behind in Tokyo, centered around the controversial debate known as Seikenron, the proposal to conquer Korea. Saigo Takamori, who had stayed behind to manage domestic affairs, argued passionately for a military expedition into Korea, believing it would provide a noble, martial purpose for the hundreds of thousands of restless, unemployed samurai who were losing their identity. When the Iwakura mission members rushed back from Europe, they were horrified by the plan, arguing that Japan was far too weak to risk an international war. They abruptly cancelled the expedition. Deeply insulted and politically isolated, Saigo resigned from the government in protest, retreating to his home province alongside thousands of loyal followers. Back in Tokyo, the reforms continued with dizzying, brutal speed. The old feudal domains were abolished entirely, replaced by prefectures run by governors appointed directly by Tokyo. The four-tier social caste system was eradicated, declaring all citizens equal under the emperor. This meant that the samurai lost their exclusive right to bear arms and their government stipends, which were forcibly converted into one-time, rapidly depreciating government bonds. In 1876, the government issued the Haitore Edict, legally forbidding the samurai from wearing their two swords in public. The ultimate symbol of samurai identity, the soul of the warrior, was outlawed overnight. In place of the samurai elite, the government introduced a universal military conscription law. Every young man, whether the son of a samurai or a poor rice farmer, was required to serve 3 years in the newly formed Imperial Japanese Army, trained by Prussian officers and armed with modern rifles. The samurai class, which had dominated Japanese history for 700 years, found itself completely stripped of its purpose, its privilege, and its identity. This rapid destruction of tradition bred a deep, painful tragedy, personified by the very man who had led the imperial forces to victory, Saigo Takamori. Saigo had supported the restoration to protect Japan, but he grew increasingly disillusioned by the total, reckless westernization of his country. He watched with a heavy heart as young bureaucrats in top hats and tailcoats replaced the old codes of Bushido with Western materialism and political corruption. Saigo argued that the samurai spirit was the true soul of Japan, and that by erasing it, the country was losing its identity. In 1877, Saigo became the reluctant leader of a massive rebellion of disgruntled samurai, the Satsuma Rebellion. Leading an army of over 20,000 warriors, many armed only with their traditional katanas and older muskets. Saigo marched against the government he had helped create. It was the ultimate tragic clash between the ancient world and the modern era. Saigo's samurai fought with legendary bravery, but they were facing a modern conscript army backed by railways, telegraph lines, and endless ammunition supplies. The rebellion reached its bloody climax at the Battle of Shiroyama. Surrounded on a misty hillside, wounded by gunfire, Saigo Takamori committed ritual suicide, seppuku, as a true samurai. The rebellion was crushed, proving once and for all that the age of the sword was dead, and that the new peasant conscript army was the undisputed master of the battlefield. Yet the Japanese public, and even the emperor himself, wept for Saigo, recognizing him as the last samurai, a tragic hero who died for a world that had outgrown him. With all internal resistance broken, the industrialization of Japan went into hyperdrive. To jumpstart this transformation, the regime relied heavily on Oyatoi Gaikokujin, hired foreigners. Thousands of Western engineers, geologists, and educators were brought in at astronomical salaries to lay down tracks, build deep-water docks, and teach industrial chemistry. However, the Meiji leaders were deeply paranoid of foreign leverage. These experts were strictly treated as short-term employees, tasked with training local apprentices before being systematically replaced by Japanese experts as soon as the technology was mastered. The government built the first railway line between Tokyo and Yokohama. Its opening celebrated by the emperor wearing traditional silken robes but riding inside a modern steam locomotive. Silk mills like the model facility at Tomioka, coal mines and shipyards sprouted across the islands, funded initially by heavy taxation on the peasantry and then sold off to powerful family-owned conglomerates known as the Zaibatsu, like Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and Sumitomo. Telegraph lines stitched the islands together, and a national public education system achieved near-total literacy within a single generation, drilling young children in Western mathematics alongside absolute loyalty to the imperial throne. In 1889, the nation reached its political maturity with the promulgation of the Meiji Constitution. Drafted by Ito Hirobumi after deeply studying the legal systems of Europe, particularly the authoritarian-leaning model of Imperial Germany, the constitution created a modern parliament, the Diet, but carefully preserved the absolute authority of the emperor, declaring his lineage sacred and inviolable. Japan had achieved the impossible. It had rewritten its entire society, built a modern industrial economy, and assembled a world-class military, all while retaining its distinct cultural soul and independence. The true test of this new empire arrived at the turn of the 20th century on the global stage. In 1894, Japan went to war with the massive Qing dynasty of China over control of the Korean peninsula, stunning the world by easily defeating its former cultural mentor through superior Western-style industrial organization. A decade later, in 1904, Japan faced an even greater challenge: the Russian Empire. In the Russo-Japanese War, the Imperial Japanese Navy, utilizing advanced tactical maneuvers and British-built battleships, completely annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. It was the first time in modern history that an Asian nation had defeated a major European superpower in a full-scale war. Japan was no longer a potential victim of Western colonization. It was an undisputed colonial empire in its own right. When the Emperor Meiji died in 1912, he was laid to rest amidst a nation completely unrecognizable from the isolated feudal islands of his youth. In less than half a century, Japan had leapt across centuries of human development, transforming from a medieval shogunate into a roaring industrial giant. The Meiji Restoration stands as a breathtaking testament to human adaptability, a story of how a nation looked into the jaws of colonization and chose to reinvent itself through sheer will, sacrifice, and pragmatic vision. The samurai had laid down their swords, but their spirit of absolute discipline and loyalty had been forged into the steel of a modern nation, launching Japan onto a path that would change the destiny of the world forever. Thank you for watching Layback Historian. If you enjoyed this epic journey through the twilight of the samurai and the dawn of modern Japan, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment about the tragic destiny of Saigo Takamori, and share this video with fellow travelers of the past. Until next time, take care and keep exploring the stories that connect our world.